Now, when I submitted the title several months ago, I was thinking of the Cambodian horrific, sustained mass atrocity in between 1975 and 1978. I was using the word genocide, and the more I researched, the more I realized that it's debatable whether that term is used for the whole thing, because insofar as the Khmer Rouge may have wanted to eliminate the Cham Muslim minority, that may be applicable, but they did not intend to eliminate their own people, but certainly did engage in mass atrocities. I will, for the publication, there are a bunch of things I need to revise and specify. So I may or may not end up using that word in the final title. But my title is Genocide as Technique and Resistance to Technical Domination in Both City and Country. And so it takes one of the most visible aspects of the Cambodian mass atrocities in the late 70s and asks about how that relates to technology, because that's one of the places where I saw some interesting potential with Ellul's thought. But first, to set the scene, Ellul did write on Cambodia. He wrote in, his son Jean was an anthropologist who specialized in Cambodia. In 1982, Ellul published a book called Changer de Révolution. This was the third of a trilogy he wrote on revolution, starting with Autopsy of Revolution, then he had De la Révolution aux Révoltes, and then finally he had Changer de Révolution. And so these remarks were published in 1982. But to set the scene, what I, as a 10-year-old in 1975, and thousands, millions perhaps, of television viewers around the world saw. In the spring of 1975, television viewers around the world met with a startling sight. The newly victorious communist rulers of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, were evacuating the country's cities. Thousands of people, men, women, old, young, were leaving the capital, Phnom Penh, taking what belongings they could. Over the succeeding months and years, reports filtered through from refugees of labor camps, arbitrary executions, and a suspicion of anyone educated. An analysis written not many years after the Khmer Rouge regime had been overthrown by the Vietnamese at the end of 1978 emphasized the ethno-nationalist aspirations of the Khmer Rouge. To outsiders who were not in there, the regime seemed anti-city, anti-education, anti-foreigner, and perhaps implicitly anti-technology. Just realize I'm not using a microphone. Has that been what we do in these smaller rooms? Are we supposed to?
I don't think so.
Okay, okay, yeah.
You're clear.
Okay, good. Yet, for Jacques Ellul, in his 1982 book, Changer de Révolution, the Khmer Rouge's policies and their disastrous results are an example of what always happens in industrialization, the formation of a proletariat, whether it is capitalism's workforce stripped of roots or much life beyond work, or labor camps in the Soviet Union and Communist China. Industrialization needs workers to bow to its demands. Ellul finds the Khmer Rouge's policies and their horrific results especially tragic, considering that Cambodia's agricultural productivity had traditionally been enough to feed its population, blunting any demand for industrialization. Ellul sees imprisonment, political purges, and even massacres as having had more precedent as practices of autocratic regimes than the death through work of Cambodia's own citizens. He sees Khmer Rouge policies as having justified, quote, the mortal enslavement of a whole people, unquote, because of the mutual reinforcement of two ideological beliefs: that the revolution, whose purpose is ostensibly happiness and well-being, must be sustained by, quote, production at any price, unquote, and that work is, quote, at once producer, redeemer, educator, bearing in itself its meaning. these are my translations. This Changer de Révolution, unless it's happened in the last few years, to my knowledge, has not been translated into English.
Sorry, excuse me. Did you call the security logging into the computer?
No?
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. When I read that, I recognized that Ellul's emphasis on Khmer Rouge policies as paragons of industrialization was different from interpretations of them as isolationist, ethno-nationalist, or aiming at an agrarian utopia. But my focus was elsewhere then on different research. This conference gives me a chance to revisit that contrast and use it to ask questions about how to resist the technological imperative in city as well as country. Since this conference emphasizes the technological society, I will primarily be using Ellul's theses in that book and examining how Khmer Rouge policies do or do not fit in with what he expects there. However, there are many themes in Ellul's other books, such as the discussion of political religions in The New Demons, histories going in a direction of greater accumulation of power in Autopsy of Revolution, and violence as begetting more violence in his book Violence, that could easily be applied to the Khmer Rouge. If someone wanted to do a whole Ellul applied to the Khmer Rouge, you could do it with a lot of Ellul's books. While doing the research for this paper, I found that one scholar who's interested in identifying multiple influences on Khmer Rouge policies and complexifying the outside impression I discussed earlier, that, well, it's an agrarian utopia, it's ethno-nationalism. There were some factors like that, but there are multiple influences. One scholar interested in complexifying this picture is Dr. James Tyner. He's a geographer at Kent State, and that is the very same Kent State University where 4 students were fatally shot by National Guard troops in 1970 while protesting against the American bombing of Cambodia. Tyner's discipline is political geography, such as who is seen to belong or feels that they belong in a certain space and is seen to not be belonging and not expect to belong in other places, and how people conceive and shape spaces in relation to power. And he uses a lot of primary documents from the Documentation Center of Cambodia, and he's written several books on different aspects of life and death under the Khmer Rouge, such as the manufacturing of famine, and this did not happen only under the Khmer Rouge. There were famines before, when the Americans were bombing, and there were famines after, when the Vietnamese had taken over. But yes, under the Khmer Rouge. And Tyner freely acknowledges his debt to continental philosophy. So he uses Marx, but in showing that the Khmer Rouge policies actually were more state capitalist than socialist. And he's clear that he does not want to endorse the Khmer Rouge policies, even though he is also using Marx. And his main other continental philosophical influences are Michel Foucault in things like biopower and the discipline of bodies and surveillance, and Giorgio Agamben in terms of the concept of homo sacer or sacer, where somebody is stripped of pretty much everything in life except just their existence, and therefore can be sacrificed. And so part of me thinks, well, you know, he's using a lot of the same influences that Ellul had, in that either it was a direct influence, such as Marx, or Ellul knew of these other continental philosophers. And is he making it too easy? And so you may decide. I found Tyner's books very useful because they distilled a bunch of information into these different aspects. And wow, there's a lot here that Ellul also wrote about. But Tyner never cites Ellul. I'm not sure if he's aware of him or not. Anyway, from Marx, Tyner gets the critique of capitalism, whether conducted by private exploiters or states, as denying workers much of the value of what they create. From Foucault, he gets the interest in body politics, discipline, and surveillance, And from Agamben, he gets the concept of the homo sacer, someone who is so stripped of normal life connections that they have only bare life and exist only to be sacrificed. Like Ellul, Tyner is influenced by Marx, yet highly critical of the kinds of regimes that many supposedly Marxist parties have set up. I have not seen Tyner cite Ellul anywhere in his work. He does not seem to be looking for technique as an independent variable. The next section of the paper will take some of the things that Ellul says about how technique operates in the technological society and see how they fit in with Tyner's analyses of primary documents from the Khmer Rouge era. I will look at 4 theses that Ellul says. He has these different areas, and he'll say, well, techniques like this, and techniques like that, or this happens. And there are dozens of them, but just 4. Economic technique is anti-democratic. Judicial technique is substituting order for justice. Work and propaganda as human techniques, and the conflict between the politicians and the technicians. So, in the technological society, Ellul characterizes economic technique as anti-democratic. He applies this thesis across the board to both non-communist and communist countries. Whether the desire for efficiency comes from the state or private enterprises, even those with worker participation in management, it is technique, not workers' or consumers' desires, that determines what will be produced and how. The apparent blurring of social classes caused by standardization is not to be confused with democracy, because it is technique that is enforcing conformity, not people's desires to be uniform. The Khmer Rouge's economic techniques included several components, including some contrary to the image of a regime that wanted to be autarkic and isolationist. There was the organization of people, including newly evacuated people from the cities, into collective farms and work brigades, separating the sexes and limiting the amount of time people spent with their families. There was the attempt to boost rice production so that there would be enough to feed the people, and also engage in foreign trade with certain communist and non-aligned countries. There was the substitution of rice rations for currency, meaning that people were dependent on the state for their subsistence. And as the difference between the government's plans and actual harvest grew, there were reductions in these rice rations, prioritizing foreign trade over the nutritional needs of the people. There were attempts to construct or rebuild irrigation systems. Tyner sees ideological lineages in some of these policies. The collectivization was inspired by the Soviet Union and China because their increase in industrial capacity was seen as a model, even though it had had ambiguous results. The emphasis on rice, Cambodia's comparative advantage, was part of an effort at import substitution that was inspired by the non-aligned movement. However, famine was the result. Tyner characterizes it as state capitalism, depriving workers of the fruits of their labor. In all these things, although officially workers were supposed to be heroes, people had little choice as to whether or how to work. Private initiatives to supplement rice rations, such as foraging and individual barter, were forbidden. In all this, the Khmer Rouge were profoundly anti-democratic. Judicial technique as substituting order for justice. Ellul sees technical law as betraying the law's link with justice. He uses a Latin phrase, summum jus summa injuria, and jus injuria. That means highest law, highest injury, and the root is the same. Justice, thinks Ellul, cannot be wholly abstract. It has to be linked to persons and concrete circumstances and their concrete environment. But when concern for persons and concrete circumstances cannot be taken into consideration, law turns into a set of rules that cares only for order, security, and obedience. Ellul goes as far as to say that efficiency is order in this context. If techniques can be found to persuade people to behave according to the law's standard, then those techniques can be applied and the law need no longer exist. In this way, the dialectic between the law and persons is lost. There is no law over against persons, and there are no persons to be regarded by the law. Tyner sees a similar phenomenon happening in the way guilt by association, enforced by bureaucratic lists, substituted for trials with evidence in what functioned as the Khmer Rouge's legal system. A fundamental distinction the Khmer Rouge made was between base people, people who had been loyal to the Khmer Rouge in the parts of the countryside that they had controlled before the final takeover of the country in 1975, and new people who were former city dwellers now forcibly relocated to the countryside. The regime favored the base people over the new people. Although their constitution that the Khmer Rouge had drawn up provided for courts, they were never established. Instead, the statutes of the Communist Party of Cambodia, which is pretty much the core of the Khmer Rouge, emphasize that party members must be vigilant about pure ideology and personal history, functioned as a way of disciplining both party members and those outside. People could be arrested and killed because they were associated with someone who was suspected of disloyalty. Low-level officials reported on incidents that deviated from expectations, for instance, the breaking of tools, and sent these reports up to the next level. By accumulating lists of personal networks and incidents in which people had been involved, a biography could be built up which, if an incident occurred which implicated someone in one social network, could lead to death. So it is guilt by association rather than law administered by evidence that someone actually personally broke the law. Then from Ellul's section on human techniques in the technological society, work and propaganda. Ellul classifies as human techniques all those methods which attempt to adjust us to our situation of living and working in the technological society. When he refers to the technique of work, he means such developments as ergonomics, workplace counseling, and vocational guidance, which he thinks are not necessarily meant to enable workers to develop meaningful relationships deeper than work, but to integrate them more fully into work processes. Propaganda functions as a human technique insofar as it, if it succeeds, bends our behavior in a certain way. It may help us get more adjusted to work or more eager to consume things. In this connection, advertising belongs to the species of propaganda. Propaganda can also create virtual worlds that contradict what we would see with our naked eyes, but are put within a context in which they seem real and urgent. The Communist Party of Cambodia believed that the process of manual labor would bring about a transformation of consciousness. Work was not just supposed to produce items for consumption and infrastructure, but produce people conscious of their role as shapers of nature. Hence, there was little room for contemplation in the Khmer Rouge's directives for how people should use their time. What time was not used for work should be occupied by, quote, light study of politics and culture, unquote. Khmer Rouge propagandistic photographs and songs were aimed at depicting a world in which people were happy working and the earth produced in abundance. Next section, the conflict between the politicians and the technicians. In the technological society, Ellul mentions a conflict that he will develop more fully in the political illusion, that between politicians and technicians. In many countries, even the Soviet Union, Ellul said, there's a core of technicians whose judgments are supposed to be beyond politics. These are not necessarily people who would have been thought of as technicians at the popular level. For instance, the military, Ellul says, are technicians in this sense. Politicians are in a bind with respect to the technicians because what the technicians recommend is the most efficient way. And in a society where the technical phenomenon rules, people will eventually demand the most efficient way. However, there may be constituencies that want something else, at least at present. Should the politicians listen to that constituency, they will be penalized when it turns out to be less efficient and other constituencies complain. A way out of this dilemma is to develop a political technique that coordinates and exercises power over different spheres of activity. Ellul thinks this is what Lenin did. If one who has read The Political Illusion looks at political decisions about technical sectors under the Khmer Rouge, one striking thing is that conflict between politicians and technicians, often did not exist because the politicians, that is the Communist Party of Cambodia, in effect appointed themselves as the technicians in that sector. An example is in medicine. Before the Khmers took over, Cambodians used a combination of traditional Khmer and Western medicine and pharmaceuticals. After the regime change, many doctors, especially the Western-trained doctors, had either fled the country or were under political suspicion for being new people and therefore potential enemies of the regime. The Khmer Rouge encouraged teenagers with little training to become medical staff, sometimes illiterate. They were trained to administer medicines and decode symbols on pill bottles. Such people would be unlikely to serve as a rival technical authority opposed to the politicians. As for political technique, the Khmer Rouge were explicitly Leninist. They imitated Lenin in believing that they should, quote, smash, unquote, the old state and smash political opponents. Killing highly educated members of one's population does not seem like a strategy to induce efficiency in health, literacy, or engineering outcomes. But it may buy time before the next rice harvest if the educated are suspected to be likely to stir up unrest. So many of the things that Ellul wrote out in 1954 fit the Khmer Rouge regime. Even though Ellul is writing about mid-20th century industrialized societies, whether communist or capitalist, whereas the Khmer Rouge were in a situation where the main industry was agriculture, and the country would have been experiencing post-war privation even without the forced migrations and forced labor that the regime demanded. Economic technique was imposed in a way that suppressed individuals' wants about working conditions and their very sustenance. Even in the absence of courts, a system of sanctions arose where order was more important than justice. Work was not only supposed to accomplish its material aim of producing rice or irrigation systems, but act as a tool to form consciousness. Propaganda was supposed to integrate people into the life of total work, even though the song lyrics spoke of fertile landscapes that were not yet realized and ignored the reality of the ever-present threat of death. Even the lack of technicians in some sectors can be seen as an example of political technique, something in evidence in the Khmer Rouge's political purges. Now I go back to the question of cities and their evacuation. When I began this study, the scenes from nearly 50 years ago of the emptying of the cities were still in my mind. I thought of how Ellul's theological judgment on cities was that they represent human beings' idolatrous construction of an environment entirely of their own making. And I thought of how industrialization wouldn't have been a word I'd used to describe the Khmer Rouge until I read Ellul's analysis of Changer de Révolution. But it was indeed an attempt at a kind of industrial agriculture. It could be seen as an attempt to reshape the countryside completely according to human demands, thus turning the entire country into a city, at least in that theological sense of that stage of Ellul's reflection on the city. Tyner notes that the emptying of the cities can be seen to have multiple causes, not that seeing the situation as more complex excuses forced migration and indifference towards those who died that way. The cities, especially Phnom Penh, had gained population rapidly during the U.S. bombing of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge needed rice production to go back up. So moving these people out of the cities and into places where they could contribute to agricultural productivity made sense. However, seeing cities as potential sites of resistance to a totalitarian regime and as sites of political diversity is an interesting counterpoint to the Ellulian interpretation of cities. His own theological development of his theme is more dialectical than this starting point, because he says God gives cities to the people after they choose them themselves. God gives cities of refuge to people escaping a murder charge, And eventually, God gives the New Jerusalem to people instead of a garden. And Ellul, as people have remarked, continue to live, work, and do volunteer work with youth in an urban area. Cities are places where we may encounter people unlike us. Or will we? Will we listen to their stories, or will we pass by in a hurry? And does the fact that we are both living in a city make us more alike than different? Considering the threats to human and other biological life caused by the drive for efficiency as an end in itself, I think we should make the effort to listen to people unlike us in both city and country. And that's all I have time for. Thank you. You want questions now, or should we do questions?
No,
in-
let's do 15 minutes of questions now.
Okay.
Thank you.